For regular videos on ancient cultures and forgotten civilizations, please subscribe. Nestled in the highlands of Bolivia, 13,000 feet above sea level, on the Andean Plateau, known as the Altiplano, there's a valley cradling the ruins of Tiwanaku. It is bounded on 3 sides by mountains, and on the 4th by Lake Titicaca. In the middle of the valley lies a series of large mounds and small platforms that mark the center of the site that ultimately reached urban densities. Estimates for the population at its peak, based on the material evidence, range from 8 to 12,000 people on the low end to 15 to 20,000 on the high end. The populace lived around a core of temples and public plazas, while its rulers dominated the resource-rich Titicaca Basin and exerted influence from here all the way down to the coastal deserts. The site's original name may have been Chukara, the Pukina name for it, which means sun's house, referring to the religious ideology associated with the site, or Taipikala, the Aymara name for it, which means central stone, referring to its place at the center of their civilization. But how old is this site? There's no doubt that it is ancient, but how ancient? Are there ways we can tell? These are questions we're going to tackle right now. There's a considerable amount of misinformation about ancient history on the internet these days, YouTube included. My aim in the Myths of Ancient History series is to seek out particularly egregious ancient history presentations, which are popular enough to lead a lot of people astray, and to show you where exactly they go wrong and why, so that you have a leg up. In this one, we are looking at a video from the UnchartedX channel. You may recognize the name, I've gone head-to-head with it before. The video is titled, How Old is Tiahuanaco? Is it the Cradle of American Man? And it argues for an age for the site of Tiwanaku that is well outside the realm of even remote probability. Let's consider why this is so. His video is an hour long and I don't want to bore you unduly, so I'm only going to play the pertinent sections. But I will leave a link to it below in case you want to go watch the whole thing and make sure I didn't take anything out of context.
Located high on the Andean Plateau of South America, in the country of Bolivia, can be found the ruins of a once mighty civilization, and amongst them the clues to one of history's most unique and enduring mysteries. What was this place? When was it built?
I understand the temptation to make this subject more exciting by emphasizing the mystery, and there are still many unanswered questions about Tiwanaku, but the basic questions have answers. What was this place? A city, there's no doubt about that. And we have a very good idea of when it was built, too. Many mysteries have become less so the more we have studied the site.
How in the world did these people survive in ancient times at nearly 13,000 feet or 4,000 meters of altitude, well above the tree line, in a place seemingly antithetical to large populations and civilization itself? Why build a city here, where crops are difficult to grow, and the struggle for simple existence is a daily battle?
One might be inclined to think that the Altiplano could not have been home to a great civilization because of the altitude and conditions up there. Yet, as abundant ongoing research confirms, it most certainly did. The people who lived here invented ingenious intensive farming and herding techniques, adapted to the different environments of the area. Numerous crops were grown here, including potatoes, oca, uyuco, and mashua, grains like quinoa and kaniwa, and legumes like tarwi and popping beans. The people devised ways to store food over the lean season. They had freeze-dried potatoes, sun-dried and salted llama, and alpaca meat. These goods helped alleviate chronic high-altitude stressors like cold and hypoxia and low oxygen tension. The lake has an abundant marine food supply, fish, shellfish, crustaceans, and sea mammals. So this talk of a struggle for simple existence on a daily basis is not supported by the evidence.
And then there's the form of the city itself. Just how was this stonework achieved? Some of the remnants left to us are both unique and utterly remarkable in their design, a seemingly playful style of endless, perfectly shaped corners, angles, channels, and even tiny drilled holes, formed with an obvious mechanical precision into very hard stone, an aspect of these ruins that is rarely explored and then never by the mainstream.
The stonework at Tiwanaku has been studied intensively. It's not the subject of this video. If you truly are interested in the evidence and findings of archaeologists regarding the stonework, I recommend the book The Stones of Tiahuanaco, a study of architecture and construction by Jean-Pierre Protzen and Stella Nair. I'll leave a link to it below. This book is so easy to find in searches that UnchartedX's assertion about this subject never being explored by the mainstream is difficult to understand. The monumental scale and graceful proportions of Tiwanaku's fine architecture has been admired by all for a long time, but our interpretations of these impressive structures have been mostly ahistoric until very recently. The fact that these massive stones lie toppled on the ground and several of the buildings are unfinished has stimulated theories that a catastrophe, such as an earthquake, an invasion, a revolt, or a deluge, destroyed the city and displaced its populace. Catastrophic explanations of the collapse of high civilization appealed to early travelers and scholars with romantic worldviews. While there was some limited archaeological work done in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it's really been from the 1970s until now in-depth scientific archaeological study has been done at Tiwanaku. Unfortunately, as we will go on to see, UnchartedX is not much interested in the work done here in the last 50 years.
Known today as the twin sites of Tiwanaku and Pumapunku, there has been considerable controversy around just when they were originally built.
The Pumapunku is not separate from Tiwanaku, but part of it. Sometimes there's confusion about this, so I probably should clear that up before we get into it. Tiwanaku has two zones of monumental architecture. The main core sits to the east of the modern town of Tiwanaku and consists of 6 impressive buildings: the Sunken Temple, the Kolata, the Putini, the Kerikala, the Kantatayita, and the Akapana. A kilometer to the southwest lies the Pumapunku complex, but they're all part of Tiwanaku. As you will see, the structures in this complex were built at different times in the history of the city, and most of them were refurbished numerous times, or rebuilt or remodeled. The monuments are surrounded by the remains of residences and non-monumental structures, covering an area of about 6 square kilometers, which are indicated by the presence of ceramics of the Middle Horizon period. Briefly, here are the 4 most important constructions. The Sunken Temple is the earliest known structure. It is a relatively small, rectangular court sunk into the ground with a single staircase directing people into it from the south. The Kolata replaced the Sunken Temple as the main attraction of this area. It was built over the top of an elite residential area, archaeologists having found that underneath it. The Kolata was one of the first complexes to be built on an east-west axis. A balcony was added to the west side later on. The Akapana is an even more impressive structure. It consisted of 7 superimposed terraces that reached up to a high platform. The main staircase is on the west side. Surrounding the landing were massive andesite pedestals that supported chachapumas, human feline figures holding heads. Construction of the Akapana pyramid was made possible by raising previous ritual buildings, including sections of the Kolata complex. The Akapana was built and rebuilt over many generations. And then we have an independent ritual complex to the south, the one that everyone talks about, and that is the Pumapunku. It was partly contemporaneous with the Akapana. There were at least 3 major phases of its construction. A recent study used 3D modeling to reconstruct what it would have looked like when complete, but it never was fully finished.
There has been considerable controversy around just when they were originally built.
The controversy he's speaking about is not between archaeologists, historians, or scientists. They are largely all in agreement. No, he means controversy generated by the people who want to sell you the older, more romantic worldview, dressing it up with new tech or science fiction and telling you the experts are trying to fool you. If you think I'm being uncharitable by saying that, consider that these people never address the evidence that has been gathered at the site, only bits and pieces that they can use to their advantage. If any evidence conflicts with what they believe, they ignore it or dismiss it out of hand. Compare that with the people who work at the site, who document and record everything, and try to explain and account for every last detail, no matter what. Don't believe me? Keep watching.
If you ask mainstream academia, the consensus is generally that it was founded around 110 AD and went on to eventually collapse around 1000 AD. This estimation of the age of Tiwanaku, made around 2012, is derived entirely from the results of C14 radiocarbon dating and another technique known as Obsidian hydration dating.
UnchartedX is incorrect when he says that the age of Tiwanaku is derived entirely from radiocarbon dating and Obsidian hydration dating. There are both absolute dating methods and relative dating methods at our disposal, which have revealed Tiwanaku's long and complex history. What is relative dating? Archaeologists seriate. That is, they determine the sequence of material styles in an area, mainly through stratigraphy, and then compare the material styles across contexts in order to determine what material items are contemporaneous with one another. Archaeologists identify historical periods by noting changes in the material record relating to artifacts, architecture, iconography, systems of production, settlement patterns, and spatial organization. What this has enabled us to see is how Tiwanaku grew and developed over time, from the first settled villages in the Lake Titicaca Basin in the early formative period, to the Tiwanaku period, when the ceremonial center of the culture urbanized. It's important to note, and I can't emphasize this enough, that many material artifacts, like pottery and tools, are inextricably tied to the remains of buildings. They cannot be separated from one another because of the way they were layered in the ground. We know from examination of the material remains from a much wider area that the Wari Empire and Tiwanaku were peer polities. They were contemporaneous. They traded and shared certain artistic styles. Since the material evidence links them and puts them in the same time period, and the material evidence is an inextricable part of the Tiwanaku site, including the buildings, it is not possible to separate the buildings out. Everything is part of a network of evidence, and so the buildings of Tiwanaku have to be from the same time period as Wari. Just looking at the time of the city of Tiwanaku itself, a sequence chronology for ceramics runs as follows. 1, we've got the first appearance of the Kolata red-rimmed and zonally incised pottery style. 2, we've got the last appearance of the Kolata zonally incised pottery. 3, the last appearance of the Kolata red-rimmed pottery. And 4, the first appearance of Tiwanaku redwares. Now, carbon dating and other radiometric measurements constitute absolute dating. It enables archaeologists to put actual dates to the stages of the sequences they establish through relative dating. The dates for the sequence of Tiwanaku ceramics were calculated by using organic material from the vessels themselves to obtain carbon dates and then calibrating them using Bayesian modeling. And they indicate a calibrated date of 120 CE for the first marker, 240 for the second, 420 for the third, and 590 for the fourth. This provides us with a sequence and reliable dates for each step. Archaeological excavations within the corridor between the Kolata platform and the Chunchukala complex shows that the Chunchukala complex is chronologically earlier than the Kolata platform. We know this because the green gravel surface associated with the bottom step of the eastern entrance of the Chunchukala goes underneath the Kolata. The initial ceramic analysis is in agreement, dating the Chunchukala complex to the formative period, between 600 and 200 BCE. It's from the same time as the sunken temple. Carbon dates from construction fill put the building of the Kolata platform between 300 and 500 CE. It probably replaced the sunken temple as the primary focus of the emerging ritual city, though we are still in the pre-urban period. Nevertheless, the Kolata platform shows a capacity now to create monuments of unprecedented size. Keep this dating in mind because UnchartedX is going to put a lot of focus on the Kolata platform a little later. Now, what about the Pumapunku? A carbon sample taken from the charcoal deep within the construction fill of the Pumapunku platform produced a date 1510, plus or minus 25 years, BP, before the present. That gives us a calibrated date of 563 CE for the construction of the Pumapunku platform. This was not charcoal from a campfire on top. It was in the fill used for construction. An archaeological deposit cannot be older than the date of the youngest object in it. That means that the platform cannot be older than the charcoal found inside it. Beginning in the mid-1970s, excavations exposed nearly the entire perimeter of the platform, revealing remains of concentric revetments. These revetments are probably the longest stretch of unbroken architecture on site. Excavations in 2000 and 2001 documented 3 dedicatory offerings placed immediately under the fine exterior andesite facings of the Pumapunku's revetments. The offerings clearly were deposited prior to the placement of the final facade of the first revetment, as they sit directly under the outermost line of stones of that revetment. The offerings include human remains. The samples were taken from charcoal that was made by burning the offerings. 2 carbon dates taken from these deposits yield calibrated dates between 727 and 769. Archaeologists believe the offerings were made at the time of construction, but then were disturbed, and the dates come from the time of disturbance. However, the locations of these deposits within the architectural stratigraphy demonstrate that they were nevertheless integral to the construction of the first version of the Pumapunku. The dates you see here in the chart are ordered in the sequence we would expect, given the site's stratigraphy and the material culture associated with the samples. This group of dates supports the documentary and artifactual data that indicate that Tiwanaku was incorporated into the Inca realm in the mid to late 16th century, and that the Pumapunku continued to be occupied into the early decades of the colonial period. I think you have a better idea now how archaeologists have arrived at the dates that they have for Tiwanaku. Most of you likely will be satisfied with this evidence. At the very least, you will understand why archaeologists and historians have the opinion that they do, and realize that they have reason for it. But UnchartedX is going to argue that this dating is wrong. And to do this, he will turn to the writings of a man who lived 100 years ago, before the vast majority of the research on Tiwanaku had been done. Let's see what evidence he provides to overturn the modern scholarly consensus.
And although there have been carbon-14 results from organic material found at the site going back to 1500 BC, these results have been dismissed as unreliable. Even so, this date of 1500 BC isn't close to the date suggested by other evidence for the true age of this mysterious megalithic city in Bolivia.
Of the carbon samples, there was one taken in the 1970s that produced a date of around 1500 BC, and yet it is now thought to be an error because we have to take into consideration all of the data, and it is an outlier.
The man who was responsible for the vast majority of the excavation, research, and even protection of the site in our modern era was Professor Arthur Posnansky, an Austrian born in Vienna in 1873.
Arthur Posnansky, a civil and geodetic engineer turned archaeologist and anthropologist, is an important contributor to the study of Tiwanaku, and up until the 1970s he was responsible for the vast majority of the research done there. But that is no longer the case. Nevertheless, I do not want to downplay his accomplishments. He published the first archaeological guide to the site. He studied the Aymara language and showed that the correct pronunciation was Tiwanaku, not Tiahuanaco, as had been thought since the 16th century. As the professor of archaeology and physical anthropology at the University of La Paz, he excavated the site at his own expense, collecting a huge number of artifacts, which now can be seen at the La Paz Museum, photographing everything he dug up. His zeal for the site saved many great stone monuments from destruction. That being said, in the early 20th century, the history of Tiwanaku still was largely unsolved, opening the way for highly imaginative conclusions. No archaeological site outside of Giza in Egypt has inspired so much speculative, pseudoscientific nonsense. And Posnansky too was caught up in this. Up until 50 years ago, before extensive and in-depth archaeological work took place, knowledge about Tiwanaku hinged largely on myth and yarn, and the site also has been appropriated for political interests. Invented history for Tiwanaku goes way back, in fact, because even the Inca appropriated it for their political interests. Alternative history people often speak of the Inca appropriating ancient sites, and although this is not the case at Sacsayhuaman carries the characteristic features of Inca architecture, that is the case here. The Tiwanaku civilization definitely preceded the Inca Empire, but the Inca told the Spanish that Tiwanaku was the place of their cosmic and ethnic genesis, where their god, Viracocha, created the world and divided the nations, giving them their own distinctive garb and customs. Beginning in the 19th century, Europeans started speculating on the origins of Tiwanaku, and a common assumption was that the ancestors of the indigenous Aymara people could not possibly have been its builders. The French naturalist Francis de Castelnau in 1850 suggested that the ancient Egyptians came here and built the site, rather than the, quote, imbecilic race that inhabits the country today, unquote. Pablo Chalon in the 1880s wrote along similar lines, suggesting we, quote, must suppose that the builders arrived suddenly in that place from some region that was already civilized by the influence of the Old World, only to disappear after a short residence without leaving descendants and without having transmitted to their successors the secret of their prodigious capabilities, unquote. And since then, proposals that Atlanteans or even aliens were the ones responsible for building Tiwanaku have been given. Some suggested that other American tribes like the Aztecs or the Toltecs built it. Posnansky wanted to attribute the site to a tribe from Bolivia, but he had a very poor opinion of the locals. Quote, the Andean Altiplano was not always as it is today, a desolate, arid, and cold region. It was not always extremely poor in vegetation and inhabited in part by groups of apparently inferior races, possessing scant civilization, like those who today speak Aymara, Quechua, Pukina, Uru, etc. These groups are completely devoid of culture at the present time, unquote. So he posited that another tribe from the area, the Kula tribe, came and taught the locals how to build it. Well, you might say, at least he didn't attribute it to foreigners. But you should know that Posnansky believed the Kula people were descendants of Caucasians, and that they preserved great knowledge of building. Quote, this flowering demonstrates that the builders of the primitive epoch would never have been able to create the monuments of the second period had they not received a remarkable incentive from the most highly developed tribes of South America, the Kolas. Art and science developed from a relatively low state to a height evinced by the megalithic monuments which are still to be found. Sciences, arts, and ceramics and sculpture reached such a degree of perfection that these were not surpassed by any American people until the conquest, unquote. In his view, not all peoples of the Americas were heirs to the glory of Tiwanaku. He divided the ancient people of this place into two races, both American, but one inherently superior to the other. His skull measurements that he conducted among the indigenous peoples show that his views were grounded in theories of scientific racism that were popular at the time. His theory went over well with the Bolivian authorities because it gave them a sense of national pride and also bolstered the idea that the current leaders deserved to be in charge.
And he spent nearly 50 years working, researching, and publishing on Tiwanaku, work for which he was widely recognized for in Bolivia before eventually passing away in La Paz in 1946. Just a year before that, in 1945, his life's work was culminated in the production of the magnificent volumes known as Tiwanaku, the Cradle of American Man. These books are hard to find and quite expensive when you do, but thanks to the supporters of this channel in the last couple of years, I've been able to source them, and will be their caretakers for a while as I use them for research and share the results with you all here.
I love old books. I love collecting them, and I love finding rare ones. So I completely understand from that perspective how UnchartedX is excited to get his hands on this one. But keep in mind that science and archaeology are progressive fields. That is, they continually seek new information, new data, and thus are always being updated, always being revised. So why would UnchartedX put more emphasis on the opinions of an archaeologist working on a site such a long time ago and favor it over opinions archaeologists have today when the ones around today have information at their disposal that Arthur Posnansky did not have? When it comes to art or music, it's perfectly understandable when someone says, I like the old stuff, but I cannot understand that attitude when it comes to science. It seems to me that the only reason someone would favor the old stuff is because they are basing their opinion not on science, which can only be as good as the information at our disposal, but on whether the conclusions are personally more palatable, whether they match up with a person's preconceptions or desires or ideology. But we cannot discard the mountain of research that has been done at Tiwanaku over the last several decades. Our understanding of Tiwanaku has changed over time as we have gathered more evidence. Early explorers saw it as the remains of a mysterious civilization situated in a desolate landscape. Bolivian nationalists saw it as the capital of a great military empire. Today, Tiwanaku is seen as a political and ritual center of a federation of communities. What archaeological work around Lake Titicaca has revealed is a long history for this area, one of gradual growth and development. I know UnchartedX hates hearing the word gradual. I think it is important to emphasize this because people like UnchartedX love to talk about catastrophes destroying civilizations, but not so much about how civilizations came to be. In the Archaic period in this region, people slowly began to switch from a hunter-gatherer lifestyle to a sedentary one. In the early formative period, we have evidence for many different communities forming near the lake, such as the Chiripa culture, which was the first in the area to have monumental architecture. And by the middle formative period, it had several major regional ceremonial centers scattered around, the site of Chiripa itself being a mortuary ritual center for many different communities in the area, represented by diversity in the material styles of artifacts. On the opposite end of Lake Titicaca was the Kaluyu culture, equally influential. This is the period of what is called the Yayamama religious tradition, meaning mother-father, known for its sculpted stone stelae and panels that decorated temples and plazas. Then in the late formative period, we have the emergence of Pucara, an extensive settlement at the center of a large network of political alliances, economic activity, and religious practice. The Pucara polity collapsed after the year 250, and this allowed for the rise of Tiwanaku. Tiwanaku, another multi-community polity, would become the greatest of all of them. Lake core samples taken indicate that around the time of Tiwanaku's emergence, the lake levels were rising and the climate getting wetter. It is possible that older trade routes were flooded, and this permitted inland sites like Tiwanaku to take over. By the year 500, Tiwanaku was the most extensive center in the Lake Titicaca basin.
In Posnansky's work, spread across 4 volumes that span a vast array of topics, he dates not the founding of the city, but rather the second period of occupation at Tiwanaku to the period around 15,000 BC. That's 17,000 years ago, a date unsurprisingly scoffed at by modern academia, who point to radiocarbon dating as a rebuttal, and on that basis simply dismiss Posnansky's work.
Please note that Posnansky's date for Tiwanaku just so happens to fit with UnchartedX's own belief that an advanced civilization existed prior to a worldwide cataclysm that occurred 12,000 years ago. This, dear viewers, is the reason why he's a fan of Posnansky. Posnansky could have written the same book with the same kinds of arguments, but if his date didn't fit with UnchartedX's, UnchartedX would dismiss it as nothing to take seriously.
But just how valid is this dismissal? After all, carbon-14 dating might just be the last time somebody was buried there, or started a campfire there. It says nothing about the age of the stonework itself.
But when samples for carbon dating are taken from within the original fill, inside the construction itself, it does tell us something about the age of the stonework.
Although Posnansky's research was done before radiocarbon dating was a thing, he didn't just pull the figure of 15,000 BC from thin air. Rather, it is the result of studies of the geological and climatic history of the region, connections to now extinct flora and fauna, semi-fossilized animal remains, folklore, cultural history, and Tiwanaku's connections to other ancient cities of the Americas, studies of erosion at the site, and most significantly, astronomical dating based on the alignment of a structure known as the Callicisia, which is much more than simply a ceremonial space. It is, in fact, a very accurately constructed solar observatory. Funnily enough, and despite mainstream archaeology's brusque dismissal of Posnansky's primary work, much of his observations in these history-adjacent scientific fields like geology and astronomy have in fact been validated and strengthened by modern research in recent years.
Okay, so UnchartedX is claiming he does look at modern research, just not in archaeology or history. For him, the important fields of study in dating Tiwanaku are geology and astronomy, and they lend support to Posnansky's hypothesis that Tiwanaku is more than 10,000 years old. So, let's look at the evidence he presents from these fields.
Arthur Posnansky titled Tiwanaku the cradle of American man for good reason. as he believed that once Tiwanaku itself became unlivable, for reasons that we'll get into, its inhabitants slowly spread out into the Americas and left their cultural legacy and clues within later ancient civilizations for us to decode today.
In the field of anthropology, diffusion is one of the explanations for how certain innovations and practices originate in various places in the world. It's the idea that these practices spread from one place to another, instead of arising independently. There are different forms of diffusionism. Today it is generally thought that every society is influenced by others, particularly those nearby, but that this is contingent on various factors. Some posit that there were a limited number of culture centers or culture circles from which practices spread. An extremist form of diffusionism, which gained influence in the 19th century and was still popular in Posnansky's time, is heliocentric diffusionism, the idea that all cultures originated from one culture center. You still find this idea bandied about in pseudoscientific literature, especially relating to Atlantis.
Posnansky documents many more connections between the culture of Tiwanaku and those of presumably later ancient civilizations, as shown by this map, illustrating the radiation of cultural indicators into not just South America, but also Central and North America.
You're going to find this a lot in nationalistic discourse. Our country is where it all started. Posnansky's position is very pro-Bolivia. Today, professionals in the field make an effort not to succumb to this type of propaganda, particularly, as in the case here, when the evidence is lacking. Posnansky claimed Tiwanaku was the cradle of civilization, and he attributed the trans-American diffusion of the Tiwanaku civilization to the climatic decline of the Altiplano.
These immigrants then, carrying with them their cultural baggage, spread throughout all those parts of the hemisphere which still remained unaffected by the climatic aggression, disseminating as they went their enlightenment and beliefs. The possibility of civilizations existing in South America many thousands of years ago isn't just an idea unsupported by evidence, quite the contrary. While the most well-known culture of the region, that of the Inca, thrived during a short period in relatively recent times, the 14th to 16th century AD, many researchers speculate that it was itself built upon the ruins of a long-gone and undocumented megalithic civilization. This idea is supported by analysis of the stonework, architecture, and the timeline of the 13 successive High Inca rulers.
As we now know, Tiwanaku collapsed only a few generations before the Inca state at Cusco gained momentum. But even before the Inca got to Tiwanaku, the Aymara people began to reassert themselves and establish well-organized kingdoms there. The Lupaca and Kula states were the biggest, and they vied with each other for power. If left be, they may have reformed a new Tiwanaku empire, but alas, the Inca came and put an end to that, bringing the people into submission. They appropriated the mystique of Tiwanaku for themselves, constructing an identity around it so that they could lay claim to it, much as the Bolivian elites would do later.
There are, however, other sites and evidence for older civilizations outside of the Inca. In the highlands to the northeast of Lima, the site of Chavan de Huanta, or Chavan Temple, as mentioned earlier, has a history stretching back 5,000 or more years with radiocarbon results from around 3000 BC, as well as evidence for massive megalithic work found on the site. It's a beautiful and remote place, one that I visited in 2016, and research on the site shows a direct connection to the culture of Tiwanaku.
UnchartedX points to a connection between the site of Chavan de Huantar and Tiwanaku. Since they are not far from one another, influence from one to the other is a reasonable conclusion. I don't know why he's pointing to carbon dating as evidence in this case, as he dismissed it so easily before. Maybe it was just a campfire at Chavan de Huantar, Ben. But since we have dates for both Chavan and Tiwanaku, and they show that Chavan is older than Tiwanaku, influence would have gone from Chavan to Tiwanaku, not the other way around.
Another connection between these sites can be found in the evidence for low stepped pyramids, which were features of both locations. The structure at Tiwanaku, known as the Akapana, although covered in sediment today, is in fact a large stepped pyramid with a reservoir in its center. Another pyramid site exists in Peru, on the coastal deserts north of Lima, known as Corral. Here also there is strong evidence dating this site back to at least the time of the Old Kingdom in Egypt, some 5,000 years ago, around 3000 BC.
We're still in the general region of Western South America, so influence in building styles may indeed be there, but again, Corral was earlier than Tiwanaku, so the influence would not have begun at Tiwanaku. No, the audacity of Posnansky's proposal is in his suggestion that all the cultures of the Americas can be traced back to one location. This heliocentric model of diffusionism is extreme and has very little evidential support.
If we go with Posnansky's theory that adverse geological changes and climatic aggression put a walking stick in the hands of the people of Tiwanaku, who then migrated north, possibly forming the origins of other known ancient civilizations, what specifically is he referring to? The geological history of Lake Titicaca, the Andes, and the Altiplano of Bolivia is complex, and the academic claims that have been made about this region over the last 150 years are varied and have changed over time. This is the case for much of the science of geology.
Well, that makes sense, doesn't it? As information is gathered, knowledge increases. And the greatest increase of knowledge about Tiwanaku and the area's geological history has occurred within the last 50 years. So the greatest change of opinion would occur within the last 50 years.
As any of you who follow the work of Randall Carlson will know, the doctrine of uniformitarianism, or gradualism, was the emergent science's written goal for more than half a century during the 1900s. This is the idea that the Earth has always changed in gradual or uniform ways, and the relatively gentle, natural, and slow processes of things like erosion can be used to explain the landscapes that we see. For much of the science's early history, geologists sought to explain everything via these processes, in an effort to distance themselves from the catastrophism of religion, which prior to this time was the prevailing belief. I like to think of this period as something like a huge overcorrection, with the truth being much more likely to lay somewhere in between.
This whole catastrophism versus uniformitarianism conversation is a red herring. If UnchartedX has geological evidence for a catastrophe at Lake Titicaca 12,000 years ago, all he has to do is present it. The evidence should speak for itself.
Posnansky's research indicating that this area had suffered significant upheaval, severe climate change, as well as at least 2 periods of massive flooding is now being supported by geological studies conducted in the 1980s, as well as even more recent work investigating the effects of the cataclysm of the Younger Dryas period in South America.
I looked under UnchartedX's video for citations of these studies from the 1980s that show that massive floods overwhelmed Tiwanaku, but nothing was there. Have any of you seen these studies? Have any of UnchartedX's viewers requested to see them? Mind you, even if there is a study that shows that a flood overran the area 12,000 years ago, that wouldn't mean it was the cause of Tiwanaku's destruction. First, we would have to establish that the city was there at the time.
Much later, a short glacial period occurred on the Altiplano, the residue of which, carried down by the glaciers, again closed the old drainage channels of the Andean Plateau. The waters from the melting ice then filled the basins and lower levels anew, covering the Altiplano almost in its entirety, to a height which corresponds today to nearly 3,845 meters, more or less, above sea level. With this considerable increase in its level, the lake covered nearly all of the Altiplano, which did not have even the inclination of 0.3 millimeters per meter towards the south, which it has today. Posnansky is here describing a short glacial period, followed by a warming and melting that greatly rose the level of the lake to the point much higher than it is today, in fact to a level that would have brought the waters to the very shores of Tiwanaku itself. As we will see shortly, the level of the water corresponded with the major building periods at Tiwanaku and Pumapunku of the second and third periods, when it was not only a city but also a harbour. And Posnansky found the remnants of docks, as well as a sophisticated series of canals.
It turns out that the docks that Posnansky supposedly found were examined and shown to be natural features that he misidentified as man-made. More importantly, geological studies have mapped out the history of Lake Titicaca's water levels, and what we now know is that the level was never high enough to reach the Pumapunku. The highest it ever reached was 3,815 meters above sea level, not 30 meters higher, as Posnansky believed. And in the 1960s, archaeologists found the port of Tiwanaku, which was used to transport stones to the site. It lay at Iwawi, 18 kilometers to the west-northwest on the current shoreline of Lake Titicaca, with which it was connected by road. They also found the quarry from which the stones came. It sits close to the shore as well. It would have been submerged if the water level was higher. So it is impossible for there to have been a port right at the Pumapunku.
Today, Lake Titicaca's level is some 35 or more meters, 90 to 100 feet below this level. And we know the water was at this level thanks to a well-documented and researched strand line, which runs across the Altiplano. What's interesting about this strand line, something that is perhaps a good indicator of just how long ago this might have been, is that today it has a significant tilt to it, as Posnansky says, 0.3 millimeters per meter towards the south. This results in an 800-foot or 245 meter difference in elevation over around 375 miles of this strand line. Of course, this strand line was level when it was created by the water, and over time the geology of the Altiplano has shifted to give it this tilt.
But by what scientific means is the creation of the strand line being dated? After all, it's the timing that is the pertinent issue here, right? What if the strand line is far older than even UnchartedX wants it to be?
A book authored by H.S. Bellamy, published in 1943, entitled Built Before the Flood, which was very graciously sent to me by a patron, explored the issue of the tilting strand line further. Perhaps the greatest and most puzzling discovery which was made in connection with Tiwanaku was that at the time when the buildings of the so-called Second Period were erected, the prehistoric metropolis was not a city sprawling upon a gentle rise in a wide valley, but one situated on the shore in a sheltered bight of a sort of peninsula. For Tiwanaku was a harbour city, the remains of whose quay walls are still distinctly discernible, while a number of dock-like harbour basins and a canal can also be traced. And this strand line tells another and a very strange story. It has been carefully surveyed for a length of about 375 miles, and then it was established that it is not straight. The height of the strand line relative to the ocean level decreases the further south we go.
It's interesting that UnchartedX is citing Hans S. Bellamy as some kind of authority on the subject. He was a follower of the ideas of Austrian engineer Hans Horbiger, who's the creator of the world ice doctrine. He argued that the moon was made of ice, and that the Earth has had several such satellites in the past. When the Earth's third moon had disintegrated, it collided with the Earth to cause the biblical deluge. This forced mankind to inhabit the highest mountains, where they founded a worldwide maritime civilization. As the third moon spiraled towards the Earth in ever-narrowing orbits, the Earth's rotation increased to increase the number of days in the year. This caused the oceans to form an equatorial bulge, so that Tiwanaku must have been at least 13,000 feet higher than it is now. As this happened millions of years before our present moon was caught by the Earth's gravitational pull, Tiwanaku must also be millions of years old. Now, geological evidence proves that the number of days in Earth's solar year has not significantly changed in the last 150 million years. And as you might guess, there is not the slightest geological evidence that a kilometers-high tidal bulge swept around the world in the early tertiary period. While a number of massive impact craters have been discovered around the world, geological evidence shows that they're caused by meteorites and not former moons that spiraled into the Earth. Yet Horbiger's influence still lingers in pseudoscientific literature, and it was popularized by Bellamy. Bellamy calculated in his book, Built Before the Flood, The Problem of the Tiwanaku Ruins, that Plato's account of Atlantis explains the Earth's capture of the present moon in 11,500 BC. Tiwanaku's megalithic structures and statues of giants are witnesses to the cataclysms that go back to the collision of the second moon with the Earth in the geologic past. Bellamy argued that America must be the source of mankind, and not Africa. Tiwanaku, he argues, at a height of 3,900 meters above sea level, was one of the 5 great cities of Atlantis, the others being in Mexico, Tibet, Ethiopia, and Papua New Guinea. This great maritime civilization with its superior beings came to an end 150,000 years ago when the third moon spiraled into the Earth. The survivors of Atlantis continued to build in the megalithic style, as can be seen in the primitive cultures of the original civilizations of Egypt, Sumer, China, Mexico, and Peru. Bellamy continued to write his pseudoscientific books on Tiwanaku into the 1960s. This is the fella whom UnchartedX is citing as an expert.
This diagram from his book illustrates these levels. The dark blue is the modern Lake Titicaca and Popo, and the light blue corresponds to the level of water when it was at the shores of Tiwanaku. The yellow colour of the map is terrain over 14,000 feet.
If only this diagram were accurate.
The tilting strand line of the higher water level exposes one of the several contradictions surrounding the orthodox dating of Tiwanaku, which was around 200 to 1000 AD. It's not just the strand line that confirms that the site was definitely a harbour. As mentioned by both Posnansky and Bellamy, Tiwanaku and Pumapunku still feature the remains of quays and channels. Posnansky's excavations at Tiwanaku also revealed the remains of fish and other aquatic species in the strata, some of the same species still living in Lake Titicaca, although in many cases significantly larger.
No one is arguing that the strand line does not exist, or that aquatic species aren't in the strata. The issues are whether the strand line indicates a harbor, it doesn't, or a water level at the height Bellamy proposes, it doesn't.
So, given that the water that formed the strand line was once at the shores of Tiwanaku, which was a harbour, and given that water finds its level and that the strand line was once flat, and remembering the mainstream date for the end of Tiwanaku is around 1000 AD, is it likely that the geography of the Andes and the Altiplano have tilted to such an extent in over just the last 1000 years? Or is it far more likely that this process of tilting the strand line to its 800-foot delta from north to south has taken many thousands of years, and that Tiwanaku was constructed far earlier? It's an interesting problem, and one I hope to discuss with other researchers and geologists who might help to shed some more light on the enigma of the tilting strand line.
Well, I can answer that. Geologists say that the strand line was created in the remote past when the entire Altiplano rose from the bottom of the ocean. The strand line was caused by an imbalanced rise. Geologic forces lifted the continent to a greater height in the north than in the south. And this is why the level indicated by the strand line is not parallel with that of either Lake Titicaca or the present ocean. That slanted strand line was there long before Tiwanaku was ever built. And so were the fossils of marine life in the strata.
Another challenge with our modern and relatively young dating for Tiwanaku has to do with the current climate of the Altiplano. Today, an arid and inhospitable place, not at all conducive to supporting the large population and civilization required to construct such a metropolis.
Perhaps I should pause to note that people live in this area today and grow crops there, so we know that the current level of the lake is perfectly adequate to support a population there. In the period when scientific dating methods placed Tiwanaku, the lake level was only about 1 millimeter lower than it is today. It didn't need to be any higher for a city to be built there.
The fact remains that the current inhospitable climate of the Altiplano could not have been that under which Tiwanaku flowered and thrived, which it obviously did. The climate must have been very different during Tiwanaku's prime, and one of many lines of evidence for this is that today there can still be found the remains of terracing on the surrounding mountains. Terracing that goes right up into the current and permanent snow line. This is no good at all for agriculture now, but these terraces must have been used for that in the past, which is a clear indicator for a more benign climate, one that could have supported such a civilization.
I'd like to see the evidence that terraces were made under the present permanent snow line. The studies I've read say these terraces could be revived and used today. We've already discussed how the idea that the climate there is too inhospitable in current conditions is a myth, perpetuated by people who don't know much of anything about the region or its material evidence. And the existence of ceramics and other materials showing evidence of habitation with corresponding carbon dates demonstrates conclusively that a large number of people lived there between 500 BCE and 1000 CE.
One thing Posnansky is very clear about, and that his research demonstrates, is that there was no long period of degeneration or decay of this civilization. It seems to have ended abruptly, with many works left unfinished, the ambitious projects of the third period never completed, and Tiwanaku emptied.
Archaeologists are uncertain of the cause of the final collapse of the once powerful empire. and the reason why the city was abandoned around 1250. Climatologists have traced climatic fluctuations in the southern hemisphere, in which a period of prolonged drought hit the region around 950, which would have caused a significant reduction of agricultural production. The final blow came when the volcano Capilla erupted, spreading a thick cover of ash across the plain of Tiwanaku. Tiwanaku was finally abandoned after the disintegration of the state administrative apparatus. Only a few villages remained after that. Other scholars see Tiwanaku's collapse as a long, cumulative, violent process caused by environmental deterioration and sociopolitical fragmentation. Now, UnchartedX says that the unfinished building projects suggest a sudden end to the city. But projects can be abandoned without us having to assume they were abandoned because everyone left or was killed. A weakened state, fewer resources, these all can be reasons.
What could have happened to these people? To find out, we return to Posnansky's work. Quote, "Signs which leave no room for doubt show that outside of the Great Lake there existed, farther to the north, a number of smaller bodies of water, whose level was higher than that of the main lake. During one of the frequent seismic upheavals, the counterforts which held back the waters were opened, and as these lagoons were at a higher level, the waters were precipitated into the main lagoon. As a result, the level of the latter was temporarily augmented. As a consequence of one of these catastrophes, the Tiwanaku of the third period must have disappeared." There is another tilted strand line reported by Bellamy's work, one that is much higher than the intermediate level at the shores of Tiwanaku, several hundred feet higher. This seems like a tremendous volume of water, one that would require a truly significant source. I don't think this is the strand line representing the flood that Posnansky is referring to. He seems to be referring to a more transient, but still catastrophic, flooding event. That Tiwanaku was in fact flooded is eminently clear when you visit the site today, as much of it is still buried in alluvium, and even from Posnansky's original images, you can see that the site has been destroyed and blocks scattered everywhere.
Bellamy continues to point to geological features, the dates of which and formations of which he has no knowledge about. The fact is, there is no evidence whatsoever of a massive flood here, in this place, at the time that Bellamy is proposing. Consider also that the city's key religious symbols were thoroughly destroyed at the time of its collapse. The frieze of the elegantly sculpted gateway lintel at Cantataita was hammered violently and the metal lamina removed. The large hall on the east side of the Pumapunku was destroyed, and the giant monolith was ritually decapitated. The destruction of religious buildings and statues was ritualized and not the work of invaders. It's unlikely that the Inca did this because they saw these structures as sacred, and the chroniclers wrote that the structures had been long destroyed before the Inca got there. If a massive flood suddenly swept this place clean, at what point would these structures have been ritually destroyed by human hands?
I've heard it said on other channels and by some people something to the effect of, "There is no erosion at Tiwanaku, so it can't be that old." This is flat out false. Parts of Tiwanaku and Pumapunku show very great erosion indeed, as these were the elements from the site that were left exposed to the weathering of millennia. It's something that Posnansky commented extensively on in his work, and in fact he points to this as an indication of the very likely great age of the site.
Let's be clear, there is no such thing as an erosion dating method. Geologists agree that absolute dates cannot be ascertained by examining erosion because there are so many factors involved, and time is only one of them.
Let's quickly cover another couple of points made by Posnansky that speak to a potentially vast age for the complex. He identified remains from Tiwanaku in the same strata layer in the soil that also contained a skull from a toxodon, an elephant-sized hoofed mammal that existed in South America during the Pleistocene and went extinct around the time of the Younger Dryas, roughly 11 to 13,000 years ago.
If the toxodon skull was not found within the construction itself, it cannot be used to date the construction. I'm surprised that UnchartedX would dismiss carbon dating by saying it could just have been a campfire made on top of a construction, but when he hears about a skull found under a construction, he concludes it is from the same time as the construction.
Some of the artwork at Tiwanaku also seems to point to other extinct species from this period. There are many depictions of large cats amongst the carvings, which today are all classified as pumas. But in that case, as Posnansky points out, why do only some of these show cats with very large canine teeth, while others do not? Is it possible that these represent both pumas and smilodons, the so-called saber-toothed tiger? The name saber-toothed tiger is a bit of a misnomer. They aren't closely related to the tiger at all, but they did exist in South America and were one of many megafauna who went extinct at the end of the Pleistocene.
We're talking about interpretations of highly stylized art that is greatly worn away and it's hard to make out anymore. Take a look. How does one establish beyond reasonable doubt exactly what animals we're looking at? This can't be used as a means of dating the site. Some of the more gullible people might be swayed by the "it looks like it, therefore it is it" argument, but I'm sure people like you realize that doesn't cut it.
Now, the primary method that Posnansky used to pin a date of 15,000 BC to the second period at Tiwanaku was astronomical dating, based on changes in the obliquity of the ecliptic, analysing the alignment of the solar observatory, known as the Calcasiaya, to the precise locations on the horizon of the sunrise during the solstices. The ecliptic is the plane projected by the Earth's orbit around the Sun, more or less the disk in which all of the planets orbit. The obliquity of the ecliptic is the angle between the plane of the Earth's equator and the plane of the ecliptic. As most people know, the Earth's axis is tilted, so that angle today is approximately 23.5 degrees. This tilt in the Earth's equator gives us the seasons as we orbit the Sun. The degree of this tilt is not fixed, however. There is a slight oscillation to it, and its value swings between 22.1 degrees and 24.5 degrees in a cycle that takes around 41,000 years to complete. With careful analysis, and due to this change in the obliquity of the ecliptic, the exact location on the horizon of the sunrise changes, very gradually, over time. The solar observatory of the Calcasiaya was constructed as a marker for the sunrise on the solstices, the longest and shortest days of the year. Posnansky set out to measure the difference in the obliquity of the ecliptic at sunrise on the solstices between his time, around 1930, and when the alignment would have been precisely matched to the construction of the Calcasiaya.
Note here that UnchartedX is going to be using a long-term natural cycle, in this case the Earth's obliquity cycle, a period of 41,000 years, as a way to date the construction of a building. As you might guess, using a method such as this to determine the age of buildings is not common, particularly because it is based on the assumption that the building was constructed with an extremely precise orientation towards certain heavenly bodies, and there's no way to prove that unless the builders told us so.
It turns out that the structure also aligns with the locations for the sunsets on the solstices, I think making it undeniable that the Calcasiaya is absolutely a solar observatory and not just some sort of coincidence. But this discovery would only be made long after Posnansky had passed away.
There is general agreement that the Calcasiaya, like the sunken temple before it, functioned as an observatory. For a viewer standing on the central platform, the outer two pillars would have visually demarcated the setting sun on the two solar solstices. The north pillar indicated the beginning of winter in the southern hemisphere on June 21st, and the south pillar the beginning of summer on September 21st. Every second pillar between them marked a 30-day countdown of setting suns. The central pillar marked the equinoxes.
If we examine this phenomenon with precision instruments, we note a difference of approximately 18 minutes, which represents the change in the obliquity of the ecliptic between that of the period in which Calcasiaya was built and that which it has today. This difference has served as the basis for the calculation of the age of Tiwanaku.
Okay, so this is where the discussion of the Calcasiaya Observatory goes off the rails. The whole idea of measuring with precision instruments is based on the assumption that the construction was made so accurately that there was no discernible error. When Posnansky measured the angles between two suspected solstice points in the complex, from the eastern corner to a partially buried lava observational block, the assumed original position of the gateway of the sun, in the center of the western end of the structure, he noted that it gave an obliquity of the ecliptic not of 23 degrees 27 minutes, as for the year 1930, but 23 degrees 8 minutes 48 seconds. He supposed that the structure was not built with any error, Therefore, it had to have been built when the obliquity was 23 degrees, 8 minutes, 48 seconds. According to his calculations, the Colossasia was built circa 15,000 BC. But you see, this is the problem with this interpretation. The alignment of the Colossasia still works today. I mean, that is how it was noticed in the first place. It just isn't perfect. And it may never have been. So to assume it was perfect and then to redate it to make it so is fudging evidence to make it suit your preconceptions.
Posnansky spent years on the site carefully examining the alignment of the Colossasia, and also enlisted the help of several astronomers, like Professor Rolf Müller from the German Astronomical Mission, who spent several years on site confirming his results.
Yes, intrigued by Posnansky's findings, the German Astronomical Commission in 1926 sent an expedition to Peru and Bolivia. Esteemed astronomers Hans Ludendorff, Arnold Kohlschutter, Friedrich Becker, and Rolf Müller were among them. They certified that Posnansky's calculations were correct and that the alignment indicated a foundation date of either 15,000 or 9,300 BC, assuming the observational points were correct. Later, Müller rechecked the calculations and gave new dates of either 10,150 BC or 4,050 BC, depending on which alignments were taken. So yes, astronomers verified the alignments, but all they did was check the calculations. They were not in a position to evaluate whether or not the supposed alignments were intended by the builders, or whether the builders would have made perfect alignments in the first place. It's interesting to note that in 1930, there was a movement to replace the Gregorian calendar with another, better one. It never happened, but Posnansky was involved in the conversations, and he proposed using the Tiwanaku calendar, which he claimed to have reconstructed, along with some of his own modifications, as a superior one that the world should adopt. Bolivian elites loved it.
When this date was published by Posnansky and by the astronomers from Europe that accompanied him, it was unsurprisingly met with fairly strong criticism, most of which just dismissed the findings with terms like absurd, and with no scientific refutation.
It's not the calculations that are being refuted, it's the premise upon which the calculations were made, namely that the Colossasia must have been constructed with extreme precision. This premise was not arrived at scientifically. It was an assumption from the get-go. The calculations mean nothing if they're based on an unsupported premise.
Posnansky's conclusions were confirmed by professional astronomers during his time, but despite this, he was well aware, almost prescient in fact, that both technology and our ability to make these observations might improve in the future, and that his work could be built upon.
If Arthur Posnansky were alive today, would he ignore all the work that has been done since the 1940s, as UnchartedX has? It's an interesting question to ponder.
Posnansky's prediction that his work would be improved upon in the future was indeed correct, and here we can find a very interesting connection to something mentioned earlier, that of a brief glacial period followed by a benign climate on the Altiplano. In modern times, the same exercise of using astronomical dating and the change in the obliquity of the ecliptic at the Colossasia was undertaken, using much more accurate information, computerized data, and the astronomical almanac, which gives us more reliable values for the changes in the Earth's tilt. Professor Niels Steed and Dr. Oswaldo Rivera analysed not only the eastern sunrise points of the structure, but also the western sunset alignments for the solstices. They concluded that all four cornerstones of the monument had been accurately positioned somewhere around 10,000 BC.
Niels Steed is an amateur researcher who studies supposed foreign influences on indigenous cultures, but Oswaldo Rivera is more interesting, as he is a professional archaeologist. The story about him comes from Graham Hancock in his book Heaven's Mirror. I checked into it. Here's what I found. In January 1997, Rivera, who was the director of the Bolivian National Institute of Archaeology, was interviewed by Shun Daichi for Boss magazine on astronomical observational alignments at the Colossasia. He said, quote, "Previous researchers observed sunrise, ours observe sunset. On the opposite side against where the inner walls stand are 10 megaliths, which function as a celestial observatory." Unquote. This statement coincides with what archaeologists already believed, but when pressed a little, he suggested that maybe the Colossasia could be that old, but that more research needs to be done. And a few months later, he told Graham Hancock, who was touring the site, that it might be that old. He never gave a definitive date. Playing up the greatness and age of Tiwanaku is something Bolivian archaeologists love to do.
Dr. Rivera resigned from his post as director of the Bolivian National Institute of Archaeology shortly after this announcement, presumably as a result of this heretical observation, a not uncommon occurrence for anyone in professional academia who dares to step too far beyond the approved timeline.
I find it hard to believe that Rivera resigned his position because of what he said in this interview. The Bolivian authorities for which he worked seemed to love the hype, but there were other issues going on which resulted in a scandal involving him and several others. It all came out in July of 2010 when the Minister of Institutional Transparency and Combating Corruption formally indicted a number of people for anomalies related to the faulty construction of Tiwanaku's site museum. Among those accused of wasteful conduct, negligence, and accepting illegal contributions was Oswaldo Rivera. The minister, Nardi Sucho, announced that these people, quote, were formally accused under the crimes defined in the Penal Code for contract harmful to the state, uneconomic conduct, breach of duties, as well as illegitimate contributions and advantages, unquote. Whatever the case, as far as I can tell, no scientific paper by Rivera touting 12,000 BC as the date of the Colossusaya has ever been published. Archaeoastronomer Leonardo Benitez seems to have picked up the work after Rivera left his post, and he has said no such thing.
I think Posnansky might well have been right in his assertions for the vast age of Tiwanaku, and it seems like modern science, particularly in fields outside of archaeology, are agreeing with him.
Only with the math.
It is just speculation, but very much like Plato's story for the sinking of Atlantis at 9600 BC, aligning with Meltwater Pulse 1b and the end of the Younger Dryas, it is quite a remarkable coincidence that the dates for Tiwanaku line up so very well with those produced by modern research into the cataclysm of the Younger Dryas.
The dates line up well when you force the evidence to make them line up well.
Against all this evidence for a more ancient origin of Tiwanaku, mainstream academia has used a few C14 radiocarbon dated remains and the results of a process called Obsidian hydration dating to outright dismiss Posnansky's work. While these methods are undoubtedly useful, they're also not without their drawbacks. Carbon-14 dating doesn't work on stone and may only give you dates for the last campfire or for the last person to be interred in the ground.
UnchartedX is repeating what he said earlier. There no doubt is always the possibility of error in carbon dating, as there is in any collection of scientific data, but this is not a reason to dismiss everything you don't like. This is the same argument as, well, science has been wrong before, so they must be wrong now. In order to prevent errors, archaeologists take many samples so that they can get a better overall picture. Theories are not based on only one or two pieces of evidence. They allow the preponderance of evidence to speak. The more data you have, the less chance of error.
Both carbon-14 and obsidian hydration dating also rely on the use of constants in their calculation, when in reality these constant values can vary over time. Cosmic events, supernovas, or solar activity can affect the rate of carbon decay, and obsidian hydration dating assumes a constant rate of water absorption, which, as we've seen, likely varied in the extreme on the Altiplano as it underwent significant climate change over time.
From what I understand, the science of obsidian hydration dating in the Titicaca Basin is still in its infancy, and there really has only been one significant study published on it so far. So this is a subject we can return to later. The dating of Tiwanaku is not based on obsidian hydration, but on the science I presented earlier. However, I can tell you this. When UnchartedX speaks of supernovas and solar activity affecting the rate of carbon decay, he doesn't know what he's talking about. The checks we have done through dendrochronology have shown that the decay rate has remained relatively constant. And many experiments have been performed in an attempt to see what could alter the rate of decay, but none of them have produced any significant changes to the decay rate.
On the other hand, Posnansky undertook a huge multidisciplinary approach, combining geology, astronomy, cultural, anthropological, and paleontological methods over 50 years to come to his conclusions.
And we have seen how well they stood up to scrutiny.
He dedicated his life to studying and to preserving the great enigmatic ruins of Tiwanaku and Pumapunku, and he and his work deserve to be taken seriously. So was Tiwanaku, as Arthur Posnansky labelled it, the cradle of American man? There's certainly plenty of evidence to suggest that it might well have been, and that it may well be far older than our modern orthodox dating suggests. Hopefully, future generations of researchers and archaeologists can continue to work on this site with open minds, considering the full impact of adjacent sciences, to uncover the truth that likely lies still undiscovered, waiting patiently beneath the sediment and soil of the remote Altiplano of the Andes.
If UnchartedX really cared about future work at the site, he would care more about the work done in the last 50 years. But it matters little to him because the results don't coincide with his firmly held beliefs. So he lives in the past. Now, before you write in the comments, why didn't you talk about the precision stonework? The answer is simple. Because stonework quality is not a dating method. This video was about how we know how old the site of Tiwanaku is. Yeah, some might say, but considering how fine the stonework is, surely the people who lived there at the time you are suggesting couldn't possibly have made those monuments. I just presented you with very solid evidence that they did. For a long time, others have appropriated Tiwanaku from its people. The Inca did it, the Bolivian government did it by creating an image of ancient Bolivia to their political advantage and disenfranchising the indigenous peoples of their past. They used scientific disciplines in a non-objective way, interpreting artifacts to prove that the intellectual capacities of the nation's indigenous peoples are inferior to their rulers, the colonizers, who came from the first world. Did you know that the indigenous people have to pay entrance fees to visit their own historic sites? Yeah. So, before you jump on the natives are too primitive bandwagon, think about how, by being classified as uncivilized, Bolivia's indigenous people have historically had their self-esteem undermined, and whether you want to contribute to that, now that you know where the evidence points. In conclusion, let me just say that Arthur Posnansky brought many important aspects of Tiwanaku to light. His book, Tiahuanaco, The Cradle of American Man, however, is not only very much out of date, but filled with pseudoscientific speculations. If you are interested in Tiwanaku and want to get reliable information about it, incorporating the important discoveries of the last several decades since then, I recommend The Tiwanaku, Portrait of an Andean Civilization by Alan Kolata, and Ancient Tiwanaku by John Janusek. I will leave links for them below the video. Thank you for watching. You might like my little e-booklet, Why Ancient History Matters. It's designed to persuade people that the subject is important, even in the modern world. You might also wish to use it to help spread the word, so feel free to share it with someone you know. It's free for anyone who wants it. I've left a link in the description box below the video for you to grab a copy. Catch you later.